Working in law enforcement, where officers suit up and show up every single day and serve their communities, can be a stressful job. Some studies show that the average officer experiences more traumatic events in 6 months than the average person does in a lifetime. Fortunately, over the past few years, the profession has made great strides in emphasizing the importance of officer wellness and mental health. Today we're joined by Sherri Martin, National Director of Wellness Services for the Fraternal Order of Police.
I'm Patrick Yoes, National President of Fraternal Order Police, and this is the Blue View.
Well, Sherri, thank you for joining us today on the Blue View, and thank you for all the work that you do for wellness with the FOP. You do some great work, and our members are really benefiting from that. But for our viewers and our listeners who maybe have not seen your previous podcast that we've done with you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a retired police officer now. I started my career in law enforcement way back in 1997. I worked as a police officer first in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I went to school, Go Heels. And from there, moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where I spent most of my career in law enforcement. Patrol was where my heart was. I spent most of my career in patrol, working through the ranks, and found myself at the rank of lieutenant as a watch commander in Charleston when I left there. And I left Charleston in 2015 because I married a police officer from Connecticut, and that meant a move to Connecticut. So I stepped down from being a command staff person back to being a line patrol officer, which actually was a whole lot of fun, going back and doing the real work again. Not that command staff people don't do real work, it's just different. And I missed that police work. So I worked in Enfield Police Department in Connecticut for almost 5 years. And during the course of my law enforcement career, I went back to school, got a master's degree in counseling while I was working in Charleston, and did some work as a counselor in the VA system. So I got some of those tools under my belt, doing therapy work with veterans. And I've been a proud member of the FOP since 1997 when I started back in law enforcement, and have kind of been in various leadership roles in the FOP on the local and state level over the course of the last 20 plus years. And so when I found myself appointed to the Officer Wellness Committee, which is what we had back then, one of our many committees on the National FOP, I was very excited to bring together my love of the FOP, my experience as a police officer, and my education in psychology and counseling into that role, and to give my time on the Officer Wellness Committee. The fun thing is that some of the things that we got to do on the Officer Wellness Committee is we went out and talked to members about wellness. We did a big survey back in 2018 that I know many of our members have heard about, and kind of drew an unprecedented response to that survey about, which really told us how important mental health and wellness was to our members. So we took what we learned from that survey, and seeing that there were maybe some gaps, there was still stigma around officers asking for help, even if they, wanted it. So we started to build some programs, because the FOP is, there's a lot of concern about confidentiality and agency provided services. If your police department, doesn't or offers you services, there were still a lot of officers that were concerned about using them out of fear of being seen as weak or unfit for duty. So the FOP, we knew, was in a unique place to build some serious wellness programming to fill in those gaps, because we know that our members trust us. Our mission is to take care of police officers and improve their lives. And so we started to put together plans to build some of those programs. And when that happened, the federal government approached us and said, hey, we have some grants that might help you build these programs. And we know that you have the trust of your members. So after we were awarded grant funding, we knew that we really had to devote resources to the programs we were building and get someone to be doing that work full time. And so that's how I landed here as the first director of wellness services for this great organization. I credit the wisdom of our leadership at the time with realizing how important wellness was and still is to our members, with creating that division and putting the resources behind it. So that's kind of where I came from. I grew up as a military kid, moving all around the country. So I've lived in a bunch of different states and been all over the place. Split my time now between Connecticut and South Carolina. And so I'm proud to be here today on the Blue View.
It's good to have you, Sherri. So let's back up a little bit. You clearly, when you talk about wellness, the passion shines through. Where does that passion come from? Why? What? You're a law enforcement officer, and like all of us, somewhat cynical, and then you find yourself really immersing yourself into officer wellness. What pulled you towards that?
It's an interesting story. I didn't intend to be a police officer. It's not what I intended to do with my life. Back in college, I was a psychology major. I really wasn't sure I wanted to be a psychology major. I started out college thinking I wanted to be a judge in the court, and kind of found my way to psychology back then. And then when I graduated from college, I didn't want to go to school anymore. You really can't work in the field of psychology with a bachelor's degree. So I said, well, you know what? I think I'll go get a job. And I had been an intern at Chapel Hill Police Department while I was in school. So I started to work as a law enforcement officer. And kind of my initial interest was in forensic psychology. And, this is back in the days of Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal Lecter, and criminal profiling was a hot career. And but I just didn't want to go to school at the time. So to law enforcement I went, and found that I really enjoyed that work. It becomes part of your soul when you do law enforcement work, serving the people. And more than that, I think the fraternalism that I found in the FOP and in the profession itself really resonated with me. The brother and sisterhood and the bonds between officers. And unfortunately, a few of my coworkers took their own lives during the course of that. When it was real in my world that police suicide was an issue, because I had just as many coworkers who died by their own hand as I had coworkers who were killed in the line of duty. And so that really spoke to me. So when I went back to schooling, continued to pursue my education, I thought, really my heart any longer was not in forensic psychology, was not in exploring the minds of people, who might commit criminal acts. It was more in thinking about how I could be of service to the people that I felt like were serving their communities. And so that kind of drove me then to the wellness arena, where it started out as suicide prevention, and how do we stop police officers from taking their own lives, make them more aware of their own mental health. But now, it's about prevention. It's about living a daily life healthy every single day, so that we're not just preventing suicide, we're living the best lives we possibly can in the healthiest way. And so it's, my passion for helping police officers stay well and live long and prosper and retire well kind of evolves and changes, just like all things, right?
Yeah. It's I look at the whole wellness thing and look at it in two different aspects. The first one is that if you look at law enforcement officers when they come into this job, they all have something in common. They all had background checks, psych evaluations, and physical assessments. And it doesn't take long in seeing law enforcement officers after they've been on a job for a little while to really be declining in some of these areas, much more than people in general public. So there's definitely some signs there. And just look at the trauma that a law enforcement officer experiences. I say some studies say that average person will have 2 or 3 traumatic events in their lifetime. A law enforcement officer may have 100, 180, 200 over the span of their career, and it affects them just as much. And I've always said that we have a moral and fiduciary responsibility to fix that which has been broken in the service of others. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because, one, it's the right thing to do, but the other one is that every agency has invested a great deal of money in training and experience, development and experience with law enforcement officers. it's protecting investment as well. So regardless of what motivates, people to recognize the importance of officer wellness, I'm fine with either path as long as we get the benefits we need. But we need to start looking, and that's where your job comes in, is that we can find people, we can see them, you can tell in a lot of cases the ones that are struggling. Maybe not always. There are definitely those that don't want help, and we need to find ways to address that. But really, the bigger effort to me is we need to find ways to intercede long before we ever get to that part. It needs to be part of our culture. The training, we need to change that model. I did this job for 36 years. You never talked about these things when I first started on a job. And we did a disservice. We did a disservice by not talking about them. It's important. It affects every American across this country. And, as law enforcement officers are more susceptible as well. So I appreciate you choosing this path, because it is certainly to our advantage. And I want to talk a little bit about the FOP's role of why. And look, I'll tell you that our board recognized that this was where we needed to be. We did this a little over 3 years ago, and said, this is where we need to be. We need to be in the forefront of officer wellness. We recognize that we see our friends. I too have lost friends to suicide. That just one of them I didn't see coming. I was with him 2 days before, never said a word. And now I look back and I'll say, okay, maybe there were some indicators that I did see. But I want to talk about this path that we've taken and why it's so important, and the role that you filled. And I can tell you that your experience, the things that you've done as a leadership role within this organization, that the things that you've done in wellness made it a natural for you to be a first director. And without hesitation, the board stepped up and said, you know what, she's the right person for it. And you've not proven us wrong on any of that. So I appreciate what you're doing there. But for our listeners and viewers, tell them exactly what the Director of Wellness Services does.
We listen to the members. As we have developed all of the programs within the Division of Wellness Services, we have gone to the members and asked time and time again. With surveys, we do a national survey every 2 years now. We have done smaller surveys during the COVID pandemic. We did a survey. When we started to develop peer support training, we went to the members and asked, what do you need? What are you looking for? What would you like this to be? And so I think the one thing that's unique about the FOP is that all of the wellness program that we have developed has come from the input of our membership. Even from the very beginning, it was that survey in 2018 that drove the programs that we have now, that caused us to see the gaps and know what we needed to build. And we continuously do research. So I think that's maybe the one thing that I'm most proud of that we do, is that we are building things based on what members tell us they need and they want to see in their wellness programming. So we do research. That's maybe one of the hugest things that the Director of Wellness Services does. But we also vet providers for law enforcement. We meet with individual therapists. We meet with inpatient treatment programs. We look at wellness training programs that are out there. We look at wellness products like telephone apps that are built for law enforcement. And I and the committee of 7 professionals that I work with, these are active and retired police officers that volunteer their time on the Officer Wellness Committee, look at each and every one of those resources, because officer wellness has kind of become a popular topic in the last 5 years, which is both good and bad, right? It's great that everybody's talking about wellness. It's great that we're breaking down the stigma about using wellness services. But unfortunately, that sometimes draws people who don't have the purest of intentions, that are looking to potentially make money from, building a first responder program without the appropriate credentials to do so. And so I think it's really important work that the committee does in working with me to look at all of those resources that are out there, figure out which ones are in the game for the right reason, which ones are coming from a place of service to law enforcement and not just looking to make money, and putting those into a national directory, the Approved Provider Bulletin, which we're getting ready to launch the website for It's going to open here probably in the next day or two. And as we continuously vet providers, that approved provider bulletin, that directory of services, is going to continuously fill up as we find more and more competent providers. Because the good news is there are providers out there that want to help law enforcement, that want to work with law enforcement, that want to boost our wellness, teach us how to take care of ourselves, get us well when we're not doing so well. And it's just a matter of us finding them and finding quality and building out those resources in that guide that we have out there. Another thing that we've done, I and the committee, is we have been doing this vetting of services now for some time, even before I was on the Officer Wellness Committee, long before I was the Director of Wellness Services. The original members of the Wellness Committee had been vetting some of the programs that were out there even 5-6 years ago. And as we started to expand our vetting and do this more and more, we started to get a lot of inquiries from police agencies and police officers and their families about how we do the vetting. You know, what is it that we look at? Because they wanted to be able to do that themselves. A lot of police agencies in 2020 got some federal grant funding to build wellness programs in their agencies, and some of them weren't really sure where to go, how to start with finding competent providers. And people knew that we were doing that. So they came to us and they said, how are you guys doing this? So we published the FOP Wellness Provider Vetting Guide. You could just Google FOP Vetting Guide and it pops right up in Google. And that's a document that was created by our committee that lays out exactly what we look at when we look at a wellness service, whether it's an inpatient treatment program, a training program, an individual therapist, so that someone could take that guide and, you know, an individual, an agency, a police spouse, and use that to find an appropriate provider for them. We are writing curriculum in law enforcement peer support. That's another thing that's been a huge undertaking of our committee. We're in a cooperative agreement with the Department of Justice Cops Office to write the Power in Peers curriculum, which is our standardized law enforcement peer support curriculum. That'll begin to be rolled out at the beginning of 2023 across the country. And we'll be able to teach the same curriculum across the country to police officers so that all peer supporters across the country are trained the same way and they'll be speaking the same language. So we've got lots of irons in the fire in the system that kind of all works together. You know, those things each are kind of connected to each other because the information helps us build the systems and they rely on each other to function.
So, Sherri, one other thing that the FOP does, and you are a huge part of its success, is for 3 years now we've had a wellness summit that is growing bigger and bigger every year, and agencies are sending people over to be trained. And as you said, you know, the stigma is off now. We're talking about these issues, important. Maybe some just because they want to check the box to say that they're doing wellness, but the vast majority is because they want to do the right thing. And so with that Wellness Summit, our fourth one is coming up in Nashville the last week of January. Give us a little glimpse of what our attendees can expect for this year's Wellness Summit.
Yes, very excited about this. I've actually been working on this quite a bit this week. So the dates are January 30th and 31st. That's going to be at the Sheraton Music City in Nashville, same location we were in 2022. And this, the previous attendees to the summit will see a little bit of the same structure, but as always, we bring in new presenters every year to keep what we're teaching fresh. We make sure that we look at what's current. And so we're going to have some really interesting talks about surviving physical injuries. We're going to have some interesting talks about the legal issues surrounding those mandatory wellness checks that we see popping up around the country. You know, some challenges that have come up to wellness checks. Important things I think that people will need to know if they are going to be facing mandatory wellness checks coming up in their state, what that should look like. You know, if our lodge leaders have a hand in crafting the language around those mandatory wellness checks, we're going to give them some information that will help them do that. We're going to have breakout seminars on various topics like we normally do. I'm excited that our National Auxiliary has started to do some family wellness programming, and we're going to have them come in and talk about some of the things that they're doing. We're going to shift things a little bit to try to include families more, because that's a trend that we're seeing, that our officers want, is more programming for including the families, because families are our officers' biggest source of concern, as well as their biggest source of support. So it's become very clear to our committee that we need to start including families in this training as well. So we're excited to be doing that. We will once again offer some optional physical fitness options, which last year in 2022, we had great participation in those activities, which I was very excited to see. Kind of the whole environment around the Wellness Summit is, being healthy, getting healthy, staying healthy. We will have a number of our vetted and approved wellness providers there in our vendor area to showcase what they provide in their program, so that attendees at the summit can learn about all of those things. And then again, we are going to have the Wellness Professionals Forum again. So what we do with that is we bring in for one day wellness professionals that we have connected with. So think clinicians and those who work in these treatment facilities that serve law enforcement, to come in and network with each other and learn about what our officers are facing. We're going to give them some information about what today's officers are facing out there across the nation, because they may, have clients in one area of the country but not realize what's going on in other parts, and we want them to all be well informed. So we bring those clinicians in, let them learn and network from other clinicians, and then they're allowed to attend the summit as well if they want, and it gives them an opportunity to network with officers, and lets the officers and their families that are attending the Wellness Summit build relationships with some of those clinicians, so that it normalizes talking to a therapist, and having a friendship or a friendly relationship with a therapist to take some of that stigma away. So we're very excited. The committee has been working hard on getting this the agenda details finished, and we hope that we're going to have the best summit yet.
I'm looking forward to it, and I know that every year it gets bigger and better. So great work by your committee. Sherri, let's as we start wrapping this up, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball. I look back in my career and saw the evolution of these issues. We never talked about them before, and now we're openly talking about them and doing intervention and doing training and doing things that are helpful for the well-being of officers. Look in your crystal ball and tell me what you see for the future of law enforcement.
Oh, lots of things on the horizon. Our committee is always talking about what else do we want to do, and we always have a long list of things that we want to do someday. So hopefully someday comes soon. So one thing that we're going to be doing that's going to be a big undertaking is, in the next couple of years, we've received more federal grant funding to continue the delivery of the Power and Peers curriculum, which is our peer support curriculum. So as we go around the country and teach trainers in Power and Peers and teach officers in the Power and Peers curriculum, we're going to build a network of trained peer supporters across this country. So what that will do for us is we can have peers from all over the country, trained peer supporters, networking with each other, so that if there's an issue still where an officer is insecure about using peer support, let's say maybe they're in a small agency and they have trained peer supporters, but they're just not sure, we're going to be able to give officers across this country access to a peer supporter who might not be near them geographically, so that they can still have an ear and someone to talk to, so without being worried about their confidentiality or their privacy being compromised. So the other thing that will happen along with that is, as we build out that approved provider bulletin with the directory of wellness professionals across the country, we're going to be able to offer more direction to officers who are looking for wellness services. We're going to be able to pinpoint them in the direction of that as we continue to vet providers. That's going to be an ongoing process for the foreseeable future, because there's just so many providers out there that want to be engaged and want to be part of the effort to keep our officers well. We, as I mentioned already, we want to build out some family programming as well. We want to start to include families in our wellness efforts. I think that's a big opportunity there, working with our auxiliary to do some family wellness training, because, as we think about wellness, I think we're kind of over the hurdle of recognizing that police suicide was an issue, and there's still stigma, but we've tackled it quite a bit. So now as you mentioned, what do we do from here? Well, what I'd like to see is that we continue to be proactive, get in front of it, start at the academy level with teaching officers about holistic wellness, and by that I mean financial wellness, physical wellness, family wellness, all spiritual wellness, all of the things that keep someone well. We want to see officers not just survive, but thrive through their entire career, and pick up those habits early on that will keep them healthy. One other thing, I think that the research has played a huge role with the surveys. We're going to continue to do those. That's going to be done every 2 years. We're going to do a major survey of our membership to kind of measure where things are, to see what officers are facing, how they gauge their wellness, what they want to continue to see in wellness programming. But I think another thing that the research does for us is it pinpoints exactly how much of the struggles that officers are facing come from those traumatic incidents, how much of it comes from the things that they deal with inside the four walls of their agency. Sometimes it might be just the stresses of forced overtime or, not so great leadership that is causing them stress and causing them not to be well in their lives. And so we want to start to look at all sides of that and how to cope with all sides of that and work through it to be stronger, healthier officers. So lots of things on the horizon.
Oh, great. Sherri, I think I want to leave it at, we ended up with one thing I think is very, very important. I look at, you talked about service providers and vetting, and I think there are a lot of people out there that know that they need help, but a lot of times they are maybe reluctant to do so. And I think when you look at the vetting of these programs, there's some important factors with it. There's no shame in seeking help when you need it. But I tell you, I've looked in the faces and in the eyes of families that have been forever changed because of people that were too proud to get that to get help. The end result of it. So, if you could, I think it's important for anyone who's listening that maybe is struggling. And what do the vetting programs look like? I think they probably have a fear that they'll be thrown into a general population with people that are drug addicts and everything else that are not police. And I can understand how that would be something that would not be appealing to anyone seeking help. But that's not the case, is it? Tell us what those vetting programs are.
Yeah, we're so again excited about how we do that too. In our vetting process, so there are some other entities out there that work with law enforcement that do some vetting, but ours is the most thorough vetting process I've ever seen, and I'm very proud of that because our committee's feeling is that we would never want to recommend a service or say that a service has been vetted and approved unless we would be comfortable using that service ourselves. So, if you take, like, for example, an inpatient treatment program, that inpatient treatment program, in order to pass vetting with us, has to be first responder specific. If someone is a client in the program, they're not housed with people that are not first responders. That's kind of one of the first rules of vetting an inpatient program. The programming, whether they're going to therapy with an individual clinician or they're going to a group to have a more like a peer support discussion, it's all first responder specific. And there's many other criteria that we look at, but that's just one example. When you talk about how we vet individual clinicians, one of the criteria that we look at when we vet an individual therapist is how do they make sure that that officer, when he comes in or she comes in to see that therapist, is not going to run into a coworker who might be using the same clinician. We expect them to have a procedure for making sure that that won't happen. And so all of our vetted providers that are going to be in that approved provider bulletin have those safeguards in place. They are extremely focused on keeping the officer's privacy and their confidentiality intact. The providers that we seek and we vet and approve understand how important it is to the officer that their privacy be maintained. Most of the providers have a background in law enforcement. Either they were prior law enforcement or some other first responder themselves, or they have family that is first responders. So, those are the things that we're looking for. We on our committee are never going to vet and approve a resource that we would not use ourselves. So what we do is when we look at a program, if it's an inpatient program, we physically go there ourselves. We tour the facility. We see where an officer would live, eat, sleep while they're in the program. If it's an individual clinician, we interview them through an interview and an application process so that we can see how they interact with two police officers, who they might have in their therapy space. So if it's a training program, we sit through the training program and, see what we think about it as we experience that training ourselves. So we experience all the things, or as close as possible as an officer would experience if they went to that provider. And then once we do that, we go to our full committee and we vote as a committee on whether or not we think this entity, the provider or the program, should pass our vetting. And we go step by step through our vetting criteria, and we rate each provider or program on those vetting criteria. And then once our committee votes to approve a program to be put in our national directory, we then come to you, the executive board, for that final approval, and then we put them in that directory. So it's a multi-layered vetting process. As I said, it's the most thorough I've ever seen. And I think the important thing, much like our legal defense plan, is that it's done by cops for cops. It's us putting it together. There's not some outside entity that's not law enforcement telling us, oh, this is a good resource. We're doing it for ourselves.
Yeah. No one understands the pressures and challenges faced by cops than other cops, and nobody knows cops better than the Fraternal Order Police. Not a bad slogan, is it?
Not at all.
Sherri, the work your committee does is just outstanding, and appreciate all of your efforts. I'll give you a chance to say some final words, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
You spoke earlier about still that there might be stigma out there, and I recognize that. I mean, I lived through a career in law enforcement, and sometimes it is a hard thing to be able to say, hey, I need a hand, but there are resources out there that are good. If there is someone, we always recommend 1-800-COP line. That crisis line is meant for law enforcement, is staffed by retired police officers who have been trained to talk to fellow law enforcement who are in crisis. So, if someone is in a crisis situation, 1-800-COP line. There are other crisis lines out there also that we recommend, that we have vetted. Those will be found in that approved provider bulletin as well. But please, if you think that, if there's someone out there that thinks that they can't face another day, you can, and we're here to support you. The Officer Wellness Committee has a load of resources that we can share with our members, and so at any time they can reach out to us.
Well, thank you. And if viewers or listeners would like to learn more about the wellness program with the Fraternal Order Police, visit our website, www.fop.net, and there's constantly information being shared there. Sherri, appreciate you. And to our viewers and listeners at home, thank you for tuning in to The Blue View, where we talk about the issues that are vitally important to the men and women who suit up and show up every single day in communities across America and protect those they've sworn to serve. Thank you.
Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. To get the latest from the National FOP, make sure to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at GLFOP and on Instagram at FOP National. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.